The repair bay of Kepler's station buzzed with the usual sounds of grinding metal and hissing hydraulics. Marcus Chun wiped grease from his hands as he stepped back from the damaged cargo hauler, its hull scarred by what looked like pirate laser fire. Another day, another desperate soul limping into the station's protective embrace. The woman appeared at the bay's entrance like a ghost, her clothes worn but clean, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, a child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, with the same dark eyes as his mother. Marcus had seen enough refugees to recognize the signs. The careful way she moved, checking corners, the tension in her shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. "Excuse me." Her voice was soft, accented with the rolling tones of the Outer Rim colonies. "I was told you might have work. I can clean, organize parts, anything you need." Marcus set down his plasma torch and studied her. The child in her arms watched everything with wide, curious eyes, but said nothing. Good kid, already learned when to stay quiet. That told Marcus more about their situation than any sob story could. "What's your experience with ship systems?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. No point in getting hopes up if she couldn't handle the work. "I maintained atmosphere processors on Kepler 442b before." She trailed off, her jaw tightening, before whatever had sent her running to this backwater station with nothing but the clothes on her back and a hungry child. Before Marcus could respond, his stomach growled loudly. He glanced at the chronometer on the wall, had been working for 12 hours straight again. His lunch sat forgotten on the workbench, a protein bar, some reconstituted vegetables, and a pouch of synthetic coffee that tasted like motor oil but kept him functioning. The child's eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that made Marcus's chest tighten. When had the kid last eaten a real meal? The woman followed her child's gaze, and her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, we should go," she said quickly, backing toward the exit. "I didn't mean to bother you during your meal." "Wait." Marcus held up a hand. Something in the kid's expression, not pleading, not begging, just that quiet, resigned hunger, reminded him of himself at that age. Back when his own mother had scraped together credits for his meals while going without herself. The woman had already turned away, her spine straight with stubborn pride. She was trying to leave quietly, probably figured she'd embarrassed herself enough for one day. But that kid kept looking back at his food, and Marcus knew that look would haunt him if he let them walk away. "Hey," he called out louder this time. "I asked you a question about your experience." Rude to leave before answering. She stopped, her shoulders sagging slightly. When she turned back, he could see the exhaustion she'd been hiding, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from being on the run too long with too little rest. "I worked on atmospheric systems for 6 years," she said, lifting her chin. "Temperature regulation, air composition monitoring, emergency scrubbing protocols. I can also handle basic electrical work and have experience with waste reclamation systems." Marcus nodded slowly. Good skills, especially for a station like Kepler that was always fighting to keep its life support running smoothly. He made his decision. "Name's Marcus Chun. I run maintenance for this sector of the station. Pay's not great, but it's steady work." He gestured to the food on his workbench. "I was about to take a break anyway." "Kid looks tired. There's a rest area with some old vid screens in the back corner if you want to let him settle in while we talk details." The woman's eyes widened slightly, hope and suspicion warring in her expression. We don't want charity." "Not offering charity," Marcus said gruffly. "I'm offering work to someone with the skills I need. But I can't interview properly when I'm hungry, and that kid's going to fall asleep standing up soon." The child tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered something in her ear. She looked down at him, then back at Marcus, her resolve wavering. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said finally. "This is my son, Diego. Nice to meet you both." Marcus walked over to his workbench and divided his meager lunch into 3 portions. It wasn't much, but it was something. "So, Elena Vasquez, tell me about the last atmospheric system you worked on. What kind of problems did you run into?" As Elena began to describe the aging processors on Kepler 442b, Marcus watched Diego's eyes track the food. The kid was well-behaved, didn't reach for it or whine, just watched with the patience of someone who'd learned that wanting and getting were two very different things. Marcus made another decision. Tomorrow, he'd bring extra lunch. Hell, maybe he'd even spring for some of that expensive synthetic chocolate the station commissary sold. Kids should have treats, even refugee kids running from whatever hell they'd escaped. Elena was still talking, her voice growing stronger as she realized he was genuinely listening, genuinely considering her for the job. Diego leaned against her leg, his eyelids growing heavy despite his fascination with the promised food. The hardest part was working with old-generation recyclers, Elena continued. They required constant calibration, and the backup systems would fail if you didn't stay on top of maintenance schedules. Sounds like half the equipment we're running here, Marcus said with a dry smile. When can you start? The question hung in the air between them. Elena's breath caught, and for a moment, Marcus saw past the careful composure to the desperate mother underneath. Now, she said simply, we can start now. Marcus nodded and pushed one of the food portions toward Diego, who looked up at his mother for permission. Elena's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. Eat up, kid, Marcus said gruffly. Your mom, and I have some paperwork to go over, and you'll need your energy if you're going to help us keep this old station running. As Diego finally reached for the protein bar with trembling fingers, Marcus caught Elena's grateful look and felt something shift in his chest. Maybe it was just the satisfaction of doing the right thing. Or maybe it was something more, the recognition that sometimes the universe put people exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. The repair bay suddenly felt less lonely, filled with the quiet sounds of child eating and a mother's cautious hope. Outside, the vast emptiness of space stretched in all directions, but inside this small corner of humanity's reach, something good was taking root. Marcus rolled up his sleeves and pulled out a datapad. Time to make this official. Elena Vasquez was about to become the newest member of Kepler Station's maintenance crew, and her son was about to discover that sometimes, when you're brave enough to ask for help, the universe surprises you with exactly what you need. The first day was always the hardest, but Marcus had a feeling that Elena and Diego were going to fit in just fine. After all, the best crews were made up of people who understood what it meant to fight for survival, and these two had clearly been fighting for a long time. Now they could finally stop running and start building something new. 3 weeks later, Marcus realized he'd made the best hiring decision of his career. Elena worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to make every action count, and her technical knowledge ran deeper than her modest self-assessment had suggested. She'd already identified and fixed 12 minor system inefficiencies that had been slowly draining power from the station's grid. Diego had become the unofficial mascot of Maintenance Base 7. The kid had a natural curiosity about how things worked, and Marcus found himself explaining the basics of plasma conduits and artificial gravity generators to an attentive 4-year-old audience. Diego absorbed it all like a sponge, asking surprisingly intelligent questions that sometimes stumped the adults. Why do the lights flicker when the big ships dock? Diego asked one morning, perched on a supply crate while his mother worked on a malfunctioning air recycler. Because the docking clamps draw massive amounts of power when they engage, Marcus explained, handing him a small wrench to examine. The station's power grid has to compensate, so sometimes there's a brief fluctuation. Could we fix that? Diego asked, turning the wrench over in his small hands. Kid's got a point. Elena called from inside the recycler housing. A buffer system could smooth out those power spikes. Wouldn't be cheap to install, but it would prevent wear on the electrical systems. Marcus paused in his work on a damaged servo motor. She was right, of course. He'd been dealing with those fluctuations for so long he'd stopped thinking of them as a problem to solve rather than just an annoyance to endure. I'll run it past Station Commander Torres, he said. Might be worth the investment if it prevents larger failures down the line. This was how Elena operated. She didn't just fix what was broken, she looked for ways to prevent things from breaking in the first place. It was a mindset born from working with aging equipment and limited resources, where prevention was always cheaper than repair. The other maintenance staff had initially been skeptical of the new hire, especially one who came with a child in tow. But Elena's competence quickly won them over, and Diego's cheerful presence had an unexpected effect on morale. There's something about a kid's laughter echoing through the corridors that reminds people why they're working so hard to keep the station running. Commander Torres herself stopped by one afternoon, drawn by reports of improved efficiency ratings in Sector 7. She was a stern woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without raising her voice. "Chun," she said, nodding to Marcus. "I'm hearing good things about your new hire." "Elena's been a real asset," Marcus replied honestly. "Her background with atmospheric systems has already saved us 3 emergency shutdowns." Torres studied Elena, who is currently teaching Diego how to organize spare parts by size and function. The kid was taking the task seriously, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on getting everything just right. "Ms. Vasquez," Torres said, "I understand you have experience with large-scale life support systems." Elena straightened, wiping her hands on a rag before responding. "Yes, Commander. 6 years, maintaining atmosphere processors for a mining colony. And you left because?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "The colony was abandoned after the mining company pulled out. Most of us had to find work elsewhere. It wasn't the whole truth, Marcus could tell, but it wasn't exactly a lie either." Torres seemed to reach the same conclusion, her eyes narrowing slightly before she nodded. "I'm implementing a new maintenance protocol for the station's primary life support systems," Torres continued. "I need someone who can handle the technical oversight and training. The pay grade would be ML7, with full benefits including childcare services." Marcus felt his eyebrows rise. ML7 was a significant jump from Elena's current position. It would put her in charge of a whole department, with responsibility for training other technicians and overseeing critical systems. It was also more than Marcus made, despite his years of experience. Elena looked stunned. "Commander, I'm honored, but I've only been here 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks, you've identified more systemic improvements than my previous team found in 6 months, Torres said bluntly. "I don't care about seniority when I can see results. The question is whether you're ready for the responsibility." Diego tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering something that made her smile despite the tension of the moment. "He wants to know if the new job means we can stay," Elena translated softly. Torres's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Station policy is that essential personnel receive permanent housing assignments. If you accept the position, you and your son would have quarters in residential Block C. It's near the education center." Marcus watched Elena's face as the implications sank in. Not just a job, but a home. Not just survival, but a future. For her and for Diego. "I accept," Elena said quietly. "And, Commander, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Torres said with a slight smile. "You haven't seen the state of our backup atmospheric systems. Half of them haven't been properly serviced in years." After Torres left, Marcus found himself feeling oddly proud. He'd taken a chance on a desperate woman with a hungry child, and it had turned into something remarkable. Elena was going to do great things for the station, and Diego was going to grow up surrounded by people who cared about his future. "Congratulations," he said, meaning it. "You've earned this." Elena shook her head. "We both know what really happened here. You saw a kid watching your food and decided to be human about it. Everything else followed from that moment of basic decency." "Maybe," Marcus admitted, "but you're the one who turned that chance into something bigger. That's all you, Elena." Diego was arranging the spare parts into increasingly complex patterns, humming tunelessly as he worked. He'd grown visibly healthier in the past 3 weeks, his cheeks fuller, his energy boundless. More importantly, he'd relaxed, no longer watching corners, no longer afraid that the next moment might bring danger. "He's different here," Elena said, following Marcus's gaze. On the colony, even before everything happened, he was always tense, always waiting for something bad. "Here, he's just a kid." "Good," Marcus said simply. Kids should get to be kids. That evening, as Marcus locked up the maintenance bay, he reflected on how much had changed. The work was still hard, the hours still long, but there was a purpose to it now beyond just keeping the machines running. He was helping to build something, a community where people like Elena and Diego could not just survive, but thrive. The next morning, he'd start training Elena for her new responsibilities. She'd need to learn the intricacies of station-wide life support management, the bureaucracy of dealing with multiple departments, and the delicate art of managing a team of stubborn technicians. But Marcus had a feeling she'd handle it all with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. After all, she'd already mastered the hardest part of the job. She learned to see beyond the immediate problem to the solution that would prevent future failures. As he walked toward his own quarters, Marcus made a mental note to stop by the commissary tomorrow. Maybe pick up some of that expensive synthetic chocolate he'd been thinking about. Diego had been asking about what chocolate tasted like, and it seemed like as good a time as any to find out. Some investments, Marcus reflected, paid dividends in ways you never expected. 6 months after Elena's promotion, Kepler Station faced its first real crisis. The merchant vessel Prosperity Dawn limped into dock with its cargo bay venting atmosphere, and 47 refugees packed into a space meant for 12. The ship's captain, a grizzled woman named Sarah Chun, no relation to Marcus despite the shared name, brought news that sent ripples of fear through the station's population. The hegemony's expanding faster than anyone expected. Captain Chun reported to the emergency assembly commander Torres had called. They've taken 3 more systems in the past month. Kepler 442b is gone. They strip-mined the atmosphere processors and enslaved anyone with technical skills. Marcus felt Elena stiffen beside him. She'd never told him the full story of why she'd fled Kepler 442b, but the haunted look in her eyes now filled in the blanks he'd been too polite to ask about. "What's their timeline?" Torres asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Our best intelligence suggests they'll reach this system within 8 months, Captain Shin replied. Maybe less if they don't encounter resistance. The assembly hall buzzed with worried conversations. Kepler Station wasn't a military installation. It was a civilian trading post and refueling depot with minimal defensive capabilities. Against a hegemony battle fleet, they wouldn't last an hour. "We need to evacuate," someone called out. "Get everyone to the inner systems before they arrive." "With what ships?" another voice countered. "Half the fleet is already committed to moving refugees from the outer colonies. We need 3 times as many transports to get everyone out." Torres raised her hand for silence. "We have 8 months to prepare. The question is whether we prepare to fight or prepare to run." Elena stood up, and Marcus felt a spike of pride at the quiet authority in her voice as she addressed the crowd. "Commander, what's the station's maximum population if we convert all available space to living quarters?" Torres frowned at the unexpected question. "Maybe 8,000 if we pack people in light cargo." "Why?" "Because there are 47 refugees on the Prosperity Dawn, and Captain Shun says there are more ships coming. By the time the hegemony arrives, we could be looking at 10, maybe 15,000 people counting all the refugees." "That's impossible," someone protested. "Our life support systems can't handle that load." Elena shook her head. "They can if we upgrade them. I've been running efficiency models in my spare time. With the right modifications, we could support a population of 20,000 without straining the core systems." The hall fell silent. Marcus could see the wheels turning in Torres's head as she processed the implications. "You're talking about turning a trading post into a city," Torres said slowly. "I'm talking about giving 15,000 people a reason to fight," Elena replied. "The hegemony counts on fear, on populations that would rather surrender than resist. But if we can offer people a home worth defending, if we can prove that humanity doesn't have to choose between slavery and running forever." She let the words hang in the air. Around the hall, Marcus could see faces changing as Elena's vision took hold. Not just survival, but defiance. Not just escape, but a stand. Torres stood, her decision made. "Ms. Vasquez, I'm putting you in charge of the infrastructure expansion. You have full authority to requisition whatever you need. Mr. Chun, I want you to assist her. Your people know these systems better than anyone. As the assembly broke up into planning committees, Marcus found Elena standing alone, staring at the star chart that dominated one wall of the hall. Kepler 442b was a dim point of light at the edge of the display, already marked with a red symbol that indicated hegemony control. You never told me, he said quietly. Told you what? She replied, not turning away from the chart. That you watched them come. That you saw what the hegemony does to places like this. Elena was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. They came at night, when the atmospheric processors were running on minimum crew. Diego and I were in the residential complex. I was off shift, putting him to bed. The first thing we heard was the explosions from the orbital defense platforms. She traced a finger along the star chart, following the route from Kepler 442b to their current position. They didn't want the colony, just the infrastructure and the technical expertise. Anyone who could maintain or operate the equipment was given a choice: serve the hegemony or watch their families die. Everyone else, she shrugged, a gesture that carried the weight of witnessed horrors. How did you get out? There was a maintenance tunnel that ran from the residential complex to the primary atmospheric plant. During the initial attack, I grabbed Diego and whatever supplies I could carry and hid in the tunnels. It took me 3 days to reach the small transport ships at the industrial port. Most of them had been destroyed or seized, but there was one old cargo hauler that had been written off as junk. I got her running, and we ran. Marcus absorbed this, understanding now why Elena had been so desperate when she'd first arrived at the station. She'd watched her world burn and barely escaped with her child's life. Why didn't you keep running? He asked. There are safer places in the inner systems. Elena finally turned to face him, and Marcus saw steel in her dark eyes. Because running doesn't solve the problem. The hegemony keeps expanding, keeps taking worlds, keeps enslaving people. Eventually, there's nowhere left to run. So you want to make a stand here? I want to make a stand somewhere, Elena corrected. In this station, these people, we have something worth fighting for. We have a chance to build something the hegemony can't just take. Over the following weeks, Kepler Station transformed. Elena's infrastructure expansion plans were ambitious beyond anything the station had ever attempted. They were converting cargo bays into hydroponic farms, expanding the water reclamation systems, and building new residential modules from salvaged ship hulls. Diego, now 5 and increasingly curious about everything around him, became Elena's unofficial assistant. He would sit beside her as she worked on schematics, asking questions that sometimes sparked new ideas. Mom, why don't we build the new air cleaners in the empty spaces between the hull sections? He asked one day, looking at the station blueprints spread across Elena's workstation. Elena paused, stylus hovering over the tablet. Because there's no room for maintenance access, she said automatically, then stopped. Unless. Marcus watched as Elena's eyes lit up with inspiration. She began sketching rapidly, redesigning the atmospheric system layout to take advantage of the empty hull spaces Diego had noticed. Kid's got an engineer's eye, Marcus observed. He's been drawing pictures of the station's power systems, Elena said with a mixture of pride and exasperation. Last week I found him trying to fix the gravity generator in our quarters because he thought it was making too much noise. As the months passed and more refugee ships arrived, the station's population swelled toward Elena's projected numbers. Each new arrival brought stories of hegemony expansion, of worlds stripped bare and populations enslaved. But they also brought skills, knowledge, and determination. Captain Chun had been right about the timeline. Long-range sensors picked up the first hegemony scouts 7.5 months after the emergency assembly. The invasion fleet would arrive within weeks. But Kepler Station was no longer the vulnerable trading post the hegemony expected to find. 23,000 people now called it home, and every one of them knew exactly what they were fighting for. The life support systems Elena had designed were running at peak efficiency. The defensive systems cobbled together for merchant ship weapons and mining equipment were crude but functional. Most importantly, the population was united by the shared understanding that surrender meant slavery or death. As Marcus stood in the expanded observation deck, watching the last refugee transport dock, he reflected on how a simple act of kindness had led to this moment. Sharing a meal with a hungry child had set in motion a chain of events that might just save 23,000 lives. Elena joined him at the observation window, Diego sleepy in her arms. "No regrets?" Marcus asked. Elena looked out at the stars where, somewhere in the darkness, a hegemony fleet was approaching with conquest on their minds. "None," she said firmly. "Whatever happens, we gave them a choice. They can try to take our home, but they're going to find out that humanity doesn't surrender as easily as they think." The first phase of the battle for Kepler Station was about to begin, and Marcus had never been more proud to stand with the people he called family. The hegemony fleet emerged from hyperspace like a swarm of metal locusts, their ships arranged in perfect formation against the star field. 27 vessels ranging from massive dreadnoughts to quick-strike cruisers, all bearing the angular design and dark hull plating that marked them as instruments of conquest. Commander Torres stood in the station's newly constructed command center, surrounded by displays showing tactical information that would have been impossible to gather just months earlier. The refugee influx had brought not just population, but expertise, former military officers, intelligence specialists, and engineers who had seen hegemony tactics firsthand. "They're not moving to attack formation," reported Lieutenant Hayes, a former fleet tactical officer who'd fled the fall of the Centauri system. "Standard containment pattern. They expect us to surrender." Elena sat at the life support monitoring station, Diego beside her with a children's tablet loaded with educational games. Even in crisis, she refused to send him away. If the station fell, there would be nowhere safe for any of them. "Signal coming in," reported the communications officer. "They want to talk." Torres nodded grimly. "Put it through." The main display flickered to reveal a tall, angular figure in the pristine black uniform of the hegemony. His face was pale and sharp-featured, with the kind of cold precision that spoke of calculated cruelty. "I am Admiral Corvin of the 3rd Pacification Fleet. You are occupying a position of strategic importance to the hegemony. Surrender now, and your technical personnel will be given the honor of serving our expansion. Resist, and your population will be processed for labor allocation." Torres stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the comm channel. "I am Commander Torres of Kepler Station. We decline your generous offer." Corvin's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Most stations surrendered immediately when faced with overwhelming force. "You have 23,000 civilians aboard that station, Commander. Surely you don't wish to be responsible for their deaths." "They've already voted," Torres replied steadily. 18,000 in favor of resistance, 4,000 abstaining, 1,000 requesting evacuation. We've granted exit to those who wish to leave. The rest of us choose to stand." Marcus, monitoring the defensive systems from his engineering station, watched as the tactical display updated. The hegemony ships were spreading out, surrounding the station. Classic siege formation, they planned to starve them out if direct assault failed. "Your resistance is meaningless," Corvin continued. "We have more ships, better weapons, trained soldiers. What can civilians accomplish against military force?" Elena looked up from her displays, something in the Admiral's tone catching her attention. She'd heard that same dismissive arrogance before. On Kepler 442b, when the hegemony had assumed that a mining colony would offer no real resistance. "They're stalling," she said quietly to Torres. "Look at the formation. They're not fully deployed yet. Something's delaying them." Torres glanced at the tactical display and saw what Elena meant. Several hegemony ships were still maneuvering into position, and their weapons weren't powered up to full charge. "Admiral," Torres said, still addressing the screen. "Since we're talking, perhaps you'd explain why you need 27 ships to subdue one civilian station? Seems like overkill." For the first time, Corvin's composure cracked slightly. The hegemony brings overwhelming force to discourage futile resistance. It's more efficient than prolonged siege warfare. But Elena was reading between the lines, her experience with atmospheric systems translating to an understanding of larger logistics. They're not here just for us, she realized. This is a supply and staging point for their next expansion wave. They need the station intact, and they need the infrastructure we've built. The implications were staggering. If Kepler Station had become crucial to hegemony expansion plans, then their resistance could disrupt operations across multiple star systems. In transmission, Torres ordered. As Corvin's image disappeared, she turned to the assembled department heads. New intelligence changes our tactical situation. If they need us intact, they can't just bombard the station. They'll try to take us by boarding action, Hayes confirmed. Probably start with precision strikes to disable our defenses, then send in troops to secure key systems. Elena stood, leaving Diego with his tablet and games. Commander, request permission to implement Emergency Protocol 7. Marcus looked up sharply. Protocol 7 was Elena's contingency plan for complete system integration, linking every major system on the station through a single control network. It would give them unprecedented control over their environment, but it would also make them vulnerable to total system failure if anything went wrong. That's incredibly risky, Torres said. If they manage to hack the control network. They won't, Elena said with quiet confidence. Because they don't understand human engineering psychology. Hegemony systems are designed for efficiency and control from the top down. They expect our systems to follow the same logic. She moved to the central console, her fingers dancing over controls as she began initializing the integration protocol. Around the command center, displays began showing new connections forming between previously independent systems. What they don't expect, Elena continued, is a network designed by someone who spent years working with failing equipment and limited resources. Human engineers don't build systems that depend on central control. We build systems that can function even when half the components are broken. Marcus began to understand what she was doing. Instead of creating a centralized network that could be taken over, Elena was building a distributed web where each system could operate independently while still sharing information with the others. It's like the human brain, he said admiringly. Damage one area, and the others compensate. Exactly, Elena confirmed. And there's something else. Every refugee who's come through here has shared information about hegemony tactics, their technology, their weaknesses. We've been building countermeasures for 8 months. The tactical display updated as the first wave of hegemony attack ships broke formation, moving toward the station. But as they approached, unexpected obstacles appeared. The station's defensive grid came online. Not the crude weapons array the hegemony had expected, but a sophisticated network of interlocking fields that turned the space around Kepler Station into a maze of energy barriers and gravity distortions. Ow! Admiral Corvin's voice crackled over the comm, his composure finally broken. This level of defensive technology shouldn't exist on a civilian station. Elena smiled grimly as she coordinated the defensive systems from her console. It doesn't. This is what happens when you give 23,000 desperate people 8 months to prepare and a reason to fight. The first hegemony ships to enter the defensive grid found themselves caught in gravity wells that pulled them off course, their weapons ineffective against energy shields that shifted frequency faster than their targeting systems could compensate. But Elena knew this was just the beginning. The hegemony had more ships, more firepower, and more experience. The defensive grid would slow them down, but it wouldn't stop them. Phase 2, she called out, implementing the next stage of their defense plan. Across the station, civilian volunteers took their positions. Former miners operated drilling equipment repurposed as weapons. Merchant spacers manned improvised fighter craft built from salvage components. Engineers like Marcus prepared to defend critical systems with nothing more than determination and creative problem-solving. Diego looked up from his tablet, watching his mother coordinate the defense of their home with the same quiet competence she brought to maintaining atmospheric systems. At 5 years old, he didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew that his mother was helping to protect everyone on the station. "Are we going to win?" he asked simply. Elena paused in her work to look down at her son. Around them, the command center buzzed with activity as 23,000 people prepared to fight for their home. "Yes," she said, and for the first time since the hegemony fleet had arrived, she truly believed it. "We're going to win." The real battle was about to begin, and humanity was ready to show the hegemony what happened when you tried to enslave people who had already decided they'd rather die free. The battle for Kepler Station lasted 18 hours and changed the course of the war. What Admiral Corvin had expected to be a simple pacification operation turned into a nightmare of adaptive defenses and unconventional tactics. Every time his forces found a way through one obstacle, 3 more appeared. The station's defenders didn't fight like a military unit. They fought like a community protecting their home, and that made all the difference. Elena's integrated systems network proved to be more effective than anyone had dared hope. When hegemony troops breached the outer docking bays, automated systems rerouted atmosphere to create pressure barriers that slowed their advance. When their boarding craft tried to dock at service ports, the ports simply moved, sliding along maintenance tracks to positions where the station's defenders were waiting. "This is impossible," Corvin snarled over the tactical channel as his third wave of boarding troops found themselves trapped in a cargo bay that had somehow sealed itself and begun rotating to create disorienting artificial gravity. Civilian installations don't have these capabilities. Commander Torres, coordinating the defense from the command center, allowed herself a grim smile. "Admiral, you're fighting 23,000 people who've already lost everything once. We're not going to let it happen again." Marcus, working frantically to maintain power distribution as the station's systems operated at far beyond design parameters, marveled at what they'd accomplished. Every corridor had become a potential trap, every junction a defensive strongpoint. The refugees who'd fled hegemony conquest had turned their knowledge of enemy tactics into an encyclopedia of countermeasures. But the real turning point came when Diego, still sitting beside his mother at the life support station, made an observation that changed everything. "Mom," he said, pointing at the tactical display showing hegemony ship positions, "why are their big ships staying so far away?" Elena glanced at the display, then froze. Diego was right. The massive dreadnoughts that should have been spearheading the assault were holding position at the edge of the system, well out of effective weapons range. Their own over-reliance on centralized control networks had become a liability when faced with the station's unconventional electronic warfare capabilities. They can't adapt, Elena realized. Their ships are too dependent on automated systems, too rigid in their operational parameters. When we started broadcasting conflicting sensor data and false command signals, their systems couldn't cope. It was the same problem that had plagued the hegemony throughout their expansion. They conquered through overwhelming technological superiority, but that technology was brittle. When faced with enemies who fought outside expected parameters, it became a weakness rather than a strength. Lieutenant Hayes, monitoring the tactical situation, looked up with growing excitement. Admiral Corvin's recall his boarding teams. They're withdrawing to minimum safe distance. On the main display, Admiral Corvin's image appeared again, but the composed arrogance was gone, replaced by barely controlled frustration. "This engagement is concluded," he announced. "The third pacification fleet is withdrawing to reassess the tactical situation." Torres stepped forward. "Admiral, you're welcome to try again anytime." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same observation deck where he'd first offered Elena a job, watching as the newest addition to the station took shape. The shipyard construction had been Diego's idea, inspired by watching the salvage crews rebuild damaged vessels into defensive platforms. "If we can fix broken ships," the 6-year-old had reasoned, "why can't we build new ones that are better?" The shipyard was producing humanity's first truly post-hegemony vessels, ships designed not for conquest, but for protection, built with the same adaptive, distributed systems philosophy that had made the station's defense possible. Elena approached, carrying a datapad with the latest efficiency reports. Her position had evolved far beyond Chief of Life Support. She was now Director of Adaptive Systems, overseeing not just Kepler Station but the growing network of human settlements that had adopted similar defensive technologies. The Council's approved the next phase of expansion, she announced. 17 more systems want to implement integrated defense networks. We're going to need to train a lot more engineers. Good thing we've got a head start, Marcus replied, gesturing toward the education center where Diego and hundreds of other children were learning advanced systems theory as naturally as previous generations had learned basic mathematics. Diego himself was currently in the advanced engineering workshop, working on a miniature version of the station's power distribution network. At 6, he understood principles that would have challenged adult engineers before the war. But then, all the children growing up on Kepler Station were different. They'd been raised in a community where innovation and adaptation were matters of survival. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you just minded your own business that first day, Elena said quietly. If you'd eaten your lunch and let's walk away. Marcus considered this. Then 23,000 people would probably be dead or enslaved, and the hegemony would control this entire sector. And all because you saw a hungry kid and decided to share your food. No, Marcus corrected gently. All because you decided to turn that kindness into something bigger. You're the one who built this, Elena. All of it. Elena shook her head, but Marcus could see she was pleased. Around them, Kepler Station hummed with activity, not just the mechanical sounds of life support and power generation, but the organic noise of a thriving community. Children played in the corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of hegemony soldiers. Market stalls sold goods from across human space in bays that had been converted into makeshift battle stations. Scientists and engineers worked side by side with former refugees to push the boundaries of what was possible. You know what the real victory was? Elena asked, watching a group of children chase each other through the observation deck, their laughter bright against the backdrop of stars. What? Diego hasn't asked me if we're going to have to run again. Not once in the past 6 months. For the first time in his life, he believes that home is something permanent. Marcus nodded, understanding. That was the true measure of their success. Not the defeated hegemony fleet or the growing alliance of human worlds, but a child's confidence that tomorrow would come and his family would still be there to meet it. Think he'll become an engineer? Marcus asked, watching Diego through the education center's windows as he excitedly explained his power distribution model to a group of interested adults. Oh, he'll be much more than that, Elena said with maternal pride. He'll be part of the first generation to grow up believing that humans don't have to choose between fighting and running, that we can build something worth defending and actually defend it. As if summoned by their conversation, Diego burst through the observation deck doors, his face bright with excitement. Mom, Marcus, you have to come see this. I figure out how to make the power grid even more efficient, and Commander Torres says if it works, we can use it on the new ships. Elena and Marcus exchanged amused glances. At 6 years old, Diego was already contributing to humanity's greatest engineering project, the construction of a civilization that could stand against any threat through the simple expedient of caring more about each other than their enemies cared about conquest. Lead the way, kid, Marcus said, ruffling Diego's hair. Let's see what you built. As they followed the excited child toward the engineering section, Marcus reflected on the strange paths that life could take. A simple act of sharing food with a hungry kid had led to this moment, to a future where humanity had learned that its greatest strength wasn't its technology or its weapons, but its willingness to see strangers as family and to build something together worth fighting for. The hegemony might return someday with new tactics and better preparation, but they would find humanity changed, no longer a collection of isolated worlds to be conquered one by one, but a community that had learned the most important lesson of all, that the best defense against those who would take everything from you is to build something they can never understand, a home where everyone belongs and everyone fights to protect what they've built together. In the end, that made all the difference.